The DNA envelope was still lying between us when my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "So, are you finally ready to admit that girl was never really a Bellamy?" What she didn't know was that 10 minutes later, her own husband would stare at another DNA report and realize the child he'd raised for 5 years wasn't his either. Hi, everyone. Some people go looking for dirt so confidently they forget they might be standing in it too. Tell me in the comments, would you have agreed to that DNA test if you were Nora? And if stories like this pull you in, you already know what to do. I'm Nora Bellamy. I'm 68 years old, and until 2 weeks ago, I thought I had already survived the ugliest thing a family could do to a woman. Turns out I was wrong. The room smelled like stale coffee and printer toner. Family attorney offices always smell like that, don't they? Like secrets that have been photocopied too many times. Across from me sat my son, Elliot, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. Beside his wife, Marin, with her cream-colored coat folded perfectly over her lap. My granddaughter, Wren, sat next to me so quietly I could hear the nervous tap of her thumbnail against the metal zipper on her hoodie. 14 years old and already learning how adults ruin things. Saskia Pell, our attorney, slid the sealed envelopes onto the table. 3 of them, one for Wren, one for Elliot, one for little Callum, Marin's 5-year-old son. Marin crossed one elegant leg over the other and gave me that same smile she always used when she wanted to sound polite while cutting somebody open. "Well," she said lightly, "I suppose this settles everything." I looked at her for a long moment. Funny thing about people like Marin. They think confidence is the same thing as certainty. 2 weeks earlier, we'd all been sitting inside the Copper Heron downtown. Elliot had reserved the private dining room because Marin liked controlled environments. Her words, not mine. The room had amber pendant lights, polished walnut walls, and tiny ceramic bowls filled with smoked almonds nobody actually touched. Wren sat beside me eating truffle fries and drawing little stars on her napkin, while Elliot talked about interest rates and lakefront property renovations like anybody at the table cared. Then Marin set down her wine glass and said, "You know, it's strange." Nobody answered immediately. She tilted her head toward Wren. She doesn't resemble the Bellamys at all. I felt Wren stop moving beside me. Elliot gave a weak laugh. Marin, "No, seriously," she continued. "Different eyes, different bone structure, different mannerisms." She dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "Genetics are fascinating." I knew that tone. Marin never entered a conversation directly. She circled it first. Her mother, Colleen Vale, suddenly became very interested in her sea bass. Elliot stared into his bourbon like he hoped it would rescue him. I put my fork down carefully. Wren looks exactly like her mother did at that age. Marin smiled at me. That would matter more if anyone could actually confirm Elliot was her father. The entire table went silent. I remember hearing silverware clink somewhere in the restaurant outside our room. I remember the smell of rosemary butter. I remember Wren's face draining of color beside me. Elliot rubbed his forehead. "Can we not do this tonight?" But Marin wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at me. "I just think," she said smoothly, "before property and inheritance discussions go any further, the family deserves clarity." There it was. Not concern, not curiosity. Money. Garnet House. My home by the bay. The place she'd wanted Elliot to sell ever since developers started buying shoreline lots nearby. Wren whispered beside me, "Grandma." I covered her hand with mine under the table. Then Marin delivered the sentence that changed everything. A DNA test would solve this in a week. And my son, my own son, didn't tell her to stop. He just sat there, quiet. Wren didn't say another word during the drive home. Rain had started sometime after we left the restaurant, the kind that turned the windshield into smeared watercolor. My old Navy Buick smelled faintly of peppermint lozenges and the cedar sachets I kept under the seats. Usually, Wren liked rainy drives. She'd put her shoes up on the dashboard and make up stories about strangers in other cars. That night, she just stared out the window. Streetlights slid across her face in pale gold flashes, and every few minutes, she rubbed the sleeve of her oversized gray hoodie over her eyes, like she didn't want me catching her crying. I pretended not to notice. Some pain deserves privacy. When we pulled into the gravel driveway of Garnet House, the porch lantern was swinging in the wind. The old place creaked the way it always did during storms, like the house itself was muttering in its sleep. White shingles, rust-red roof, hydrangeas drooping near the fence line. 4 generations of Bellamy's had lived there before me. And now some woman who'd married into the family 6 years ago thought she could erase my granddaughter from it with a saliva sample. Inside, I hung my damp coat beside Wren's tiny denim jacket that she'd somehow still refused to throw away, even though the sleeves were too short now. I headed toward the kitchen automatically, reaching for the kettle. "Grandma?" Her voice stopped me. I turned around. She was standing in the middle of the hallway under the stained glass light fixture Bennett installed back in 1989. Green and amber pieces scattered little broken colors across her face. What if she's right? There it was. Not anger, not embarrassment. Fear. Real fear. Something inside my chest tightened so sharply it almost hurt. "Come here," I said softly. Wren crossed the room fast then, like she'd been holding herself together by threads all evening. She folded into my arms, taller now than she used to be, but still carrying the same lavender shampoo scent she'd had since middle school. "I don't even care about the house," she whispered. I don't want Dad looking at me like that." That nearly broke me, because I knew exactly what she meant. Elliot hadn't defended her at dinner. He hadn't defended me either. But the worst part wasn't his silence. It was the doubt. Tiny, quiet, cowardly, but there. I pulled back enough to look at her. "Listen to me carefully. Your mother loved you more than oxygen. And Elliot knows you're his daughter." But he didn't say it. No, he didn't. I brushed damp hair from her forehead. "Your father has spent most of his life trying to avoid conflict. Sometimes people confuse avoiding conflict with being kind. They're not the same thing." Wren looked down at the floorboards. "Marin hates me." "She hates losing control," I corrected gently. That mattered, because Marin didn't arrive in our lives all at once. She arrived slowly, expensively, like mold behind wallpaper. At first, she was charming. 6 years ago, Elliot brought her to Sunday dinner wearing pearl earrings and carrying a bottle of wine she pronounced incorrectly on purpose so people would correct her. Women like Marin enjoy creating tiny moments where everyone else has to participate in their performance. She walked through Garnet House that first evening, touching things with her fingertips. My antique barometer, Bennett's brass telescope, the hand-painted oyster plates in the dining room cabinet. "This place has incredible bones," she said. "Not beautiful, not warm, not home. Bones." like she was already imagining what parts could be ripped out. Back then, Wren was 8 and still missing her front teeth. She'd run into the kitchen wearing mismatched socks and tomato sauce on her cheek because she'd been helping me make cavatelli. "Daddy!" she yelled. Elliot scooped her up, laughing, and Maren smiled politely from the doorway. Then Wren asked the question that changed the entire room. "Are you going to stay this time?" I still remember the silence after that. Elliot set her down too quickly. Maren's smile froze for half a second, and I saw it. The first crack. The first realization that Elliot already belonged emotionally to someone else before she ever arrived. Not me. Wren. Over the next few years, Maren tried to compete with that bond in ways so subtle most people would miss them. She bought Wren expensive gifts after birthdays I'd already planned, corrected her posture at dinner, signed her up for activities without asking. Once she replaced the watercolor set I'd given Wren with a digital art tablet and said, "Real careers require modern tools." Wren used both. That annoyed Maren even more. The kettle started screaming behind us on the stove. I turned it off. Wren wiped her eyes. "Do I have to do the test?" I looked toward the dark kitchen window where rainwater slid down the glass in silver streaks. "No," I said quietly. "But we will." She frowned. "Why?" "Because sometimes the people who dig traps forget they might fall into them first." But I didn't say that yet. Instead, I kissed the top of her head and said, "Because I want this finished properly." At 11:42 that night, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. "Maren, one message. For transparency's sake, Elliot agrees the test should happen immediately. I already contacted Northline Genetics. Best to settle emotional confusion before inheritance paperwork progresses further." I read it twice. Then a second message came through. "Also, for fairness, we should discuss postponing any transfer of Garnet House to Wren until the results are confirmed." There it was again. Not family, not truth. The house. I barely slept that night. Not because I was worried about the DNA test. I wasn't. Wren had Elliot's stubborn jawline and his habit of chewing the inside of her cheek when she was nervous. Biology wasn't the problem. The problem was what happened after people started treating family like property law. At 6 the next morning, I found Wren sitting barefoot on the back porch, wrapped in one of Bennett's old flannel blankets. The bay behind the house looked silver blue under the fog, and gulls wheeled low over the water, screaming at fishing boats near the docks. She was holding a spoon in one hand and absent-mindedly eating leftover pistachio gelato straight from the carton. "Breakfast of champions?" I asked. She gave me a weak smile. "Couldn't sleep." Neither could I. I sat beside her, joints complaining the way they always did in damp weather. 68 teaches you exactly where every old injury lives. For a while, we just listened to the waves slap against the rocks below the bluff. Then Wren quietly asked, "Did Dad always leave?" Kids notice patterns long before adults admit them. I exhaled slowly. "Your father was good at arriving loudly. Gifts, promises, big speeches." I looked out toward the fog. "But staying? That was harder for him." Wren scraped melting gelato around the carton with her spoon. "Maren says you made me depend on you too much." That one irritated me enough to laugh. "Maren thinks affection is a competition," I said. "People like that can't understand love that isn't transactional." Wren stared down at the water. "She acts different when Dad's around." Oh, she'd noticed that too. Maren had two personalities: the polished public version with soft smiles and controlled posture, and the colder version that appeared when nobody useful was watching. I remembered one Christmas 3 years earlier. Wren had handmade everyone gifts because she'd become obsessed with pottery after taking a local art class. She spent weeks making uneven little ceramic bowls glazed in sea green colors. Mine still sat on the kitchen counter, holding sugar packets. Elliot got one shaped like a lighthouse. Maren opened hers, smiled tightly, then asked, "Oh, was this supposed to lean sideways?" Wren stopped smiling instantly, and instead of correcting his wife, Elliot chuckled and said, "Abstract art, I guess." That was the thing about betrayal. Sometimes it doesn't arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as somebody failing to protect you from it. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my cardigan. Saskia Pell. "Nora," she said after I answered, voice clipped and professional. "I wanted to inform you Maren contacted my office this morning." Of course she had. And she's requesting temporary suspension of all inheritance-related filings involving Garnet House until paternity confirmation is complete. I looked out toward the bay again. Fog drifting low, water moving slow. 14 years of bedtime stories, fevers, school lunches, violin recitals, panic attacks, braces, science fairs, reduced to administrative language by a woman who'd been here 6 years. "Did she now?" I said calmly. "There's more," Saskia added carefully. "She also asked whether Elliot could challenge your trust arrangements if Wren is excluded biologically." There it was, the real plan, not doubt. Acquisition. I felt Wren glance toward me, trying to read my expression. I smiled instead, because suddenly something about this entire situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully explain yet. Not morally, strategically. Maren was pushing too hard, and people only push that hard when they're desperate for something. By noon, Maren had already called twice more. I let both calls ring out while I cleaned striped bass at the kitchen sink. The house smelled like salt water, lemon peel, and old cedar wood warmed by the weak morning sun. Wren sat at the table pretending to do algebra homework while secretly watching me over the top of her notebook. She knew I was thinking. The third call came while I was rinsing blood from my hands. This time, I answered. "Nora," Maren said smoothly, like we were discussing brunch reservations instead of dismantling my family. "I'm glad you picked up." I think it's important we handle this maturely." That word again. Maturely. People like Maren always use calm language right before saying something vicious. "I've already spoken to Northline Genetics," she continued. "They can schedule testing Friday morning." That was fast. Well, I could practically hear her smiling. Some matters are time-sensitive. I dried my hands slowly with a dish towel. "You mean the inheritance?" Silence. Just half a second. Enough. "I mean clarity," she corrected. Of course she did. My eyes drifted toward the window overlooking the western bluff behind Garnet House. Fog still hugged the shoreline, and below it, the water glittered pale steel blue beneath the clouds. Developers had been circling this land for years like gulls around a fishing pier. Especially one man, Dashiell Crane, owner of Crane Shore Development. The kind of man who wore camel hair coats and built glass monstrosities where old homes used to breathe. 2 years ago, he offered me $4 million for Garnet House. I told him I'd rather let the ocean swallow it whole. "Nora?" Maren's voice sharpened slightly. Are you there? I'm here. Good. Then you understand why postponing any transfer to Ren is the responsible thing to do. There it was again. Not if. When. As though she'd already decided the result. I leaned against the counter. You seem awfully confident for someone asking questions. Another tiny pause. Then, I believe in facts. No. She believed in leverage. After we hung up, I noticed Ren staring at me from the table. She really wants the house, doesn't she? Children notice greed faster than adults do. I sat across from her. Garnet House sits on 13 acres of waterfront land. I folded my reading glasses carefully. To people like Maren, that's not a home. It's potential. Ren frowned. Potential for what? Luxury condos with terrible taste. That made her laugh for the first time since dinner at the Copper Heron. Small victory. But underneath it, something colder kept turning in my mind. Because I remembered something odd from 3 months earlier. Maren had insisted on hosting a family picnic near the marina. Elliot grilled overpriced Wagyu sliders, while Callum chased crabs with a plastic bucket, and Ren sketched boats in her notebook. At one point, I'd gone looking for napkins near the parking area behind the seafood market. And I saw Maren standing beside a black Range Rover, talking to Dashiell Crane. Not casually. Closely. Too closely. I remembered the way his hand rested low against her back. The way she laughed before noticing me nearby and stepping away too fast. Back then I ignored it. I shouldn't have. My thoughts broke when Ren suddenly asked, "What if the test changes how Dad sees me forever?" I looked at her carefully. 14 years old. Trying to prepare herself emotionally for rejection before it arrived. That's what children do when adults fail them enough times. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Listen to me," I said quietly. "A laboratory can tell you who contributed DNA. I held her gaze. But it cannot tell you who stayed up through your pneumonia at 9 years old, or who taught you fractions using oyster crackers, or who sat through 6 straight hours of middle school orchestra recitals." A tiny smile touched her mouth. "Those recitals were objectively terrible," she admitted. "Horrific," I agreed. Then her smile faded again. "You think Dad's scared of Maren?" That question sat between us for a moment. Outside, wind rattled the old porch chimes Bennett brought home from Santa Fe 30 years ago. Finally, I answered honestly. "No," I said softly. "I think your father is scared of disappointing whoever is standing closest to him." Friday arrived cold and bright, the kind of coastal morning where the air smells like wet stone and diesel from the fishing docks. Northline Genetics occupied the 3rd floor of a sleek medical building downtown, all smoked glass and white walls designed to make people feel smaller than their problems. Maren was already there when we arrived. Of course she was. She stood near the reception desk in a fitted ivory coat, holding a paper cup of matcha, like she'd stepped out of an expensive skincare advertisement. Elliot sat beside her, scrolling his phone too aggressively, a sure sign he was anxious. Little Callum played with a wooden bead maze in the waiting area, while Ren stayed close to my side in silence. The receptionist handed us clipboards. "Please complete all consent forms carefully." Maren immediately reached for hers. "We want expedited processing." I noticed the receptionist glance at the family grouping. Me, Ren, Elliot, Maren, Callum. Even strangers could feel something tense sitting in the air around us. Ren quietly leaned toward me. "I hate this place." "I know." The waiting room smelled faintly of eucalyptus disinfectant and burnt espresso from a machine near the hallway. Somewhere deeper in the clinic, a printer kept spitting out papers in short mechanical bursts. Maren signed her forms quickly. Too quickly. Then the nurse paused. "I'm sorry," she said politely, looking down at the paperwork. "For complete family verification, we'll also need parental signatures for Callum's comparison panel." Maren's pen stopped moving, just for a second. But I saw it. "So that part won't be necessary," she replied smoothly. The nurse blinked. "Mrs. Bellamy, your request specifically included full sibling relation analysis tied to inheritance clarification." Inheritance clarification. Interesting phrase. Maren gave a tight smile. "The concern is about Ren." I folded my gloves carefully into my purse before speaking. "You said the family deserved complete transparency," I reminded her. Elliot looked up from his phone. "If we're doing this, we should just do everything properly." Maren turned toward him too fast. "Callum doesn't need to be dragged into this." That was the first moment Elliot actually frowned at her. Not because of Ren, because of inconsistency. I watched Maren recover almost instantly. "Fine," she said lightly. "I just don't like unnecessary testing involving children." Funny, considering she'd publicly questioned a 14-year-old girl's entire identity over sea bass and wine 2 weeks earlier. The nurse led Ren first through a frosted glass door. Elliot followed for his sample. Maren sat beside me while we waited. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she crossed her legs elegantly and said, "You know, Nora, this really could have stayed private if you hadn't become defensive." I turned slowly toward her. Defensive. What an interesting word for protecting a child. "You accused my granddaughter of not belonging to her own family." I asked for verification. "No," I corrected calmly. "You asked publicly. That was intentional." Her jaw tightened slightly. People like Maren hated precise language. It cornered them. Across the room, Callum was pushing little colored beads across metal wires, completely unaware his life might be about to detonate too. For the first time, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Maren lowered her voice. "You've always encouraged Ren to depend on you more than Elliot." "That's because I was the one raising her." "That's not fair." I actually laughed at that. A short, tired laugh. "Fair?" I repeated quietly. "Fair would have been your husband acting like a father before somebody needed inheritance paperwork." Her expression hardened instantly. There she was, the real Maren, cold, controlled, calculating, not elegant, hungry. The testing took less than 20 minutes. One swab inside each cheek, one signature, one sealed file. Amazing how quickly a family can be reduced to labeled plastic tubes. As we stood to leave, Ren emerged from the hallway pale but composed. Elliot walked behind her, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Then the nurse said something that changed the entire atmosphere. "Results should be ready by Wednesday morning," she explained. "Because of the expanded comparison panel, all parties will need to be present when findings are released." Expanded comparison panel? Maren's face lost color so subtly most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. And suddenly, I became absolutely certain of something. Maren wasn't afraid of Ren's results. She was afraid of Callum's. Wednesday felt longer than entire years of my life. Ren stayed home from school pretending she had a migraine, though both of us knew she simply couldn't survive another day of whispers and sideways looks. Word had already spread among parents after Maren's little concern for transparency. In towns like ours, gossip moved faster than storms over the bay. By 10:30 that morning, we were back inside Saskia Pell's office. The same stale coffee smell, the same polished oak table, the same 3 envelopes waiting in the center like loaded weapons. I'll tell you something right now. The cruelest people always expect grace from others while giving none themselves. And honestly, sitting at that table, watching that woman stare at a 14-year-old girl like she was a legal inconvenience, I already knew somebody's life was about to crack open. What would you have done in Nora's place? Maren arrived dressed like she was attending a press conference instead of a family collapse. Cream blouse, gold watch, hair pinned back so tightly it made her look severe. Elliot came in 10 minutes later, looking exhausted, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched hard enough to ache. And little Callum wasn't there. Interesting. "Where's your son?" I asked quietly. Maren set her handbag down carefully before answering. "With my mother." Not my mother. Not Elliot's mother. Her mother. Distance already forming. Wren sat beside me, twisting the silver ring on her finger. The tiny moonstone one Bennett bought her from a flea market years ago because she'd called it witchy. She looked pale enough to disappear into the walls. Saskia entered, carrying another folder under her arm. No small talk. That's why I liked her. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and folded her hands neatly atop the paperwork. "All right," she said professionally. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that these results are confidential legal documents." Maren nodded immediately. "Of course." Too quickly again. Saskia opened the first envelope. "Regarding Wren Bellamy." The room went still. I could hear the old radiator ticking near the window. Elliot stared fixedly at the table. Wren stopped breathing entirely. Saskia glanced down at the report. Probability of paternity between Elliot Bellamy and Wren Bellamy is 99.998%. Silence. Then another page turning. Biological relationship confirmed. That was it. One sentence. 14 years of suspicion reduced to 6 clinical words. Wren made a small sound beside me. Not crying exactly. More like somebody finally exhaling after being underwater too long. I squeezed her hand hard. Across the table, Elliot closed his eyes. And Maren didn't look surprised. She looked irritated, like reality had inconvenienced her. "Well," she said after a moment, forcing a thin smile, "I suppose that settles that." No apology. Not to Wren, not to Elliot, not to me. Just annoyance that her theory had failed publicly. Saskia didn't move on immediately. Instead, she opened the second envelope. I watched Maren notice it. Her shoulders tightened. "Might not be necessary," she said lightly, "since the original concern has been addressed." "No," Saskia replied calmly. The testing package included full comparative analysis requested and signed by all participating parties. Maren swallowed. Tiny movement. Huge meaning. Elliot frowned slowly. "What comparative analysis?" Saskia looked down again. Then she spoke. "Callum Vale Bellamy shows no biological paternal match to Elliot Bellamy." The room didn't explode right away. That's the strange thing about disasters. There's usually one silent second where nobody fully understands what they just heard. Elliot blinked once, then twice. "What?" His voice sounded hollow. Saskia repeated it carefully, slower this time. There is no biological paternal relationship between you and Callum. Wren turned toward her father sharply. I looked at Maren. And for the first time in 6 years, she looked genuinely afraid. No, she said instantly. That's impossible. Saskia slid the report across the table. Maren didn't touch it. Elliot did. I watched my son's face lose all color. Line by line. His mouth opened slightly. Closed again. Then finally, he whispered one word. Who? Maren looked toward the window instead of him. That told me everything before she even answered. And when she finally did speak, the name landed in the room like broken glass. Dashiell. Nobody spoke after that. Not immediately. The heating pipes inside Saskia's office hissed softly, and somewhere outside on the street below, a truck hit a pothole hard enough to rattle the windows. Ordinary sounds. Normal sounds. The kind that feel wrong when a family detonates in front of you. Elliot kept staring at the paper, then at Maren, then back at the paper again, like the words might rearrange themselves into mercy if he looked long enough. Dashiell Crane? He finally said, voice thin and uneven. The developer? Maren crossed her arms tightly. It was years ago. Years ago. Interesting choice of words for a child who had just turned 5. Elliot noticed too. I saw it happen in his face. The math, the dates, the realization. That doesn't even make sense, he muttered. Maren stood abruptly. I'm not doing this here. But Saskia's voice stopped her cold. You requested full disclosure proceedings, Mrs. Bellamy. That landed harder than yelling would have. Maren slowly sat back down. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked disorganized. Not physically. Her hair was still immaculate, blouse still pressed perfectly smooth, but emotionally. Like someone trying to hold together a collapsing bookshelf with bare hands. Wren hadn't said a word. She sat beside me staring at Elliot, watching him, studying him, maybe trying to decide whether he looked as hurt as she'd felt 2 weeks earlier at the Copper Heron. Honestly, he did. Elliot rubbed both hands over his face. How long? Maren looked away again. It wasn't ongoing. Not an answer. He laughed once under his breath. A terrible sound. So that means yes. Nobody planned this, she snapped suddenly. You were never home, Elliot. You disappeared into work for months after the merger and— Don't, he interrupted quietly. That quietness scared me more than shouting. I'd seen Elliot angry before, loud, emotional, defensive. But this was different. This was humiliation settling directly into bone. Saskia carefully closed the folders. I strongly suggest all parties avoid making decisions today. Smart woman. Because emotions inside that room had turned radioactive. Maren suddenly looked toward me. Actually looked at me. Not through me. At me. And there it was at last. Blame. Pure blame. This is exactly what you wanted, she said coldly. I almost admired the audacity. You demanded the test, I reminded her. You pushed Elliot against me. No, I said calmly. I simply didn't stop you from digging. That hit. Hard. Elliot stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the hardwood floor. Wren flinched beside me instinctively. His eyes moved toward her then, and the guilt on his face was almost unbearable to watch. Wren. But she pulled her hand from his reach before he could touch her. That hurt him. Good. Not because I wanted him destroyed, but because maybe, finally, he understood what doubt feels like when someone you love places it on your shoulders. You know what got me most in this part? Not the cheating, not even the DNA result. It was that Elliot only fully understood Wren's pain after he felt it himself. Funny how empathy suddenly appears when the knife finally turns toward you. Me, personally? I'd never forget who stayed silent at that dinner table. Marin grabbed her handbag sharply. I'm leaving. Running already? Elliot asked without looking at her. That tone chilled the room instantly. Marin froze near the door. Then she made the mistake that ended whatever chance remained of saving her marriage. She said, "This wouldn't have happened if your mother had just transferred the property quietly like we discussed." Silence. Absolute silence. Even Saskia looked up sharply. Elliot turned toward her slowly. We. Too late. Marin realized it immediately, but panic makes people sloppy. And sloppy people tell the truth. The trust, Elliot said carefully now. The house? That's why you kept pushing this? It wasn't just about that. Just. Interesting word again. I suddenly remembered the marina parking lot. The black Range Rover. Dashiell's hand on her back. The whispered conversation that stopped when they noticed me nearby. Elliot stared at his wife like he'd never actually seen her before. And maybe he hadn't. Finally, Wren stood up. 14 years old. Shaking slightly, but standing anyway. She looked directly at her father and said the one sentence I think he'll hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. So now you know what it feels like when somebody acts like you don't belong. Nobody followed Wren when she walked out of Saskia's office. Not Elliot, not Marin, not even me at first. Because every adult in that room had frozen under the weight of what had just happened. The only person still moving forward was the 14-year-old girl they'd all dragged into it. I finally found her downstairs outside the building, sitting on the concrete planter beside a dead winter fern. The wind coming off the harbor whipped strands of hair across her face, but she didn't brush them away. She just stared at traffic. "I want to go home," she said quietly when I approached. Not angry, not crying. That scared me more. I sat beside her slowly. All right. For a minute, neither of us moved. Then she asked, "Did everybody know Dad loved Callum more?" The question hit like black ice under tires. "No," I answered carefully. But Wren gave a tiny, humorless laugh. "He never missed Callum's soccer games." She looked down at her hands. "He forgot my debate finals twice." There are moments when children stop sounding like children. That was one of them. Back at Garnet House, the silence felt heavy, but clean. Different from the poisonous quietness inside Saskia's office. Wren went upstairs without eating dinner. I heard her bedroom door close softly above me while rain began tapping against the kitchen windows again. I was pouring myself a glass of wine when my phone exploded with notifications. 3 missed calls from Elliot, 2 from unknown numbers, 1 voicemail from Marin. I listened to hers first. "Nora, this situation is obviously emotional right now, but Elliot is overreacting. We need to discuss this privately before things become unnecessarily destructive." Destructive. Interesting choice of word from a woman who detonated her own house with paperwork. Then came another message. You knew exactly what would happen when you insisted on testing everyone. I actually laughed out loud at that. Because I hadn't insisted. She had. And now she needed somebody else to carry the blame for her own greed. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across the front windows of Garnet House. Elliot. Of course. He knocked once before letting himself in with the old spare key he still had from years ago. He looked terrible. Tie gone, hair damp from rain, eyes bloodshot like he hadn't blinked properly in hours. Where's Wren? Asleep, I lied. He nodded distractedly and walked farther into the kitchen. For a moment, he just stood there staring at the old blue tile backsplash Bennett installed himself 30 years ago after watching instructional VHS tapes from the hardware store. Finally, Elliot whispered, "I don't even know what's real anymore." I leaned against the counter. That's how Wren felt at the Copper Heron. That landed. Hard. He closed his eyes briefly. I didn't think Maren would actually push it this far. No, I said quietly. You just stayed quiet long enough for her to believe she could. His jaw tightened. For a second, I thought he might argue. Instead, he sank into one of the kitchen chairs and covered his face with both hands. When Callum was born, his voice cracked slightly. I thought maybe everything finally made sense. Family. Stability. He laughed bitterly. God, I remodeled the nursery myself. I almost felt sorry for him again. Almost. Then I remembered Wren sitting silent in that restaurant, while he allowed another woman to question whether she belonged to him. Did you love Callum? I asked. Elliot looked up sharply. Of course I did. Then imagine hearing somebody imply he was disposable over dinner. That shut him up. Outside, thunder rolled low over the bay. Elliot stared toward the dark windows for a long time before speaking again. Maren said Dashiell was helping us. Us. Still us. Even now. She told me he had investors interested in shoreline redevelopment, Elliot continued numbly. Said if we sold Garnet House eventually, we could all relocate closer to the city. There it was. Finally, the truth underneath everything. Not family tension, not insecurity. A real estate deal wrapped in emotional manipulation. I folded my arms. And where exactly was Wren supposed to fit into this new life? Elliot didn't answer. Because he hadn't thought that far. Or worse, because Maren already had. The next morning, Wren refused to go to school. She came downstairs wearing one of my old Yale sweatshirts with the sleeves rolled 3 times at the wrists, dark circles under her eyes, hair tied into a careless knot that looked painfully like the way her mother used to wear it. I can't do it today, she said quietly. I didn't argue. Children spend too much of their lives being forced into rooms where adults already failed them. Instead, I made cinnamon oatmeal with sliced pears and cardamom while rain drifted sideways across the kitchen windows. Garnet House always sounded different during storms. Older, somehow, like the wood remembered every bad year before we did. Wren sat at the counter scrolling silently through her phone. Then she suddenly froze. What? She turned the screen toward me. A social media post. Somebody from school had uploaded a blurry photo outside Saskia's office building yesterday. Me, Elliot, Maren, Wren. The caption read, Bellamy family DNA scandal? Heard the rich wife got exposed, lol. I felt my stomach drop. Comments were already piling underneath. Wait, wasn't the daughter supposedly fake? No, the son wasn't the real father. Poor grandma, honestly. Trashy rich people behavior. Wren locked her phone immediately. I hate this town. I moved 2 bowls onto the counter and sat beside her. People get excited when they smell disaster. It makes them feel safer about their own lives. That's depressing. Yes, I admitted. But accurate. She stirred her oatmeal without eating it. Then quietly, do you think Dad's going to stay with her? I thought about Elliot sitting in my kitchen last night, looking like somebody had peeled the floor out from under him. I honestly don't know. And that was true. Because Elliot had always been weak in a very specific way. Not cruel, not malicious. Worse sometimes. Easily led. By fear, by comfort, by whoever spoke the loudest in the room. That afternoon, Saskia arrived at Garnet House carrying 2 legal folders and smelling faintly of expensive tobacco and rainwater. She never wasted time pretending conversations were easier than they were. I came personally because this situation is escalating fast, she said, as we sat in the library. The library had always been my favorite room in the house. Dark green walls, tall shelves, old brass reading lamps. Bennett rescued from a closing hotel decades ago. Wren sat curled into the window seat, pretending to sketch, while actually listening to every word. Saskia opened the first folder. I strongly recommend immediate protection measures regarding the property. I nodded once. I assumed as much. The issue, she continued carefully, is that Elliot technically remains your closest direct heir unless protections are finalized properly. Wren looked up sharply. So Dad could still sell the house someday? No, I said immediately. Then I looked toward Saskia. Fix it. That earned the faintest smile from her. I already started. She slid several documents across the table. Trust amendments, coastal protection clauses, occupancy restrictions, legal language dense enough to choke a horse. But the meaning underneath it was simple. Nobody was touching Garnet House. Not Elliot, not Marin, not Crane Shore Development. Nobody. As Saskia explained the paperwork, I noticed Wren watching me differently. Not scared anymore. Studying me. Finally, she asked quietly, You already knew they were trying to take the house, didn't you? I leaned back slowly. Yes. How long? Longer than I wanted to admit. Because the truth was, I'd ignored warning signs for years out of exhaustion, out of hope, out of wanting peace more than honesty. I remembered one dinner 18 months earlier when Dashiell Crane himself had shown up unexpectedly during one of Marin's cocktail evenings. He'd walked through Garnet House admiring ceiling beams and shoreline views while pretending not to calculate square footage in his head. At one point he actually said, Places like this become burdens eventually. Burdens. That's how people like him described memory. Saskia interrupted my thoughts carefully. There's another issue. I looked up. She hesitated very slightly before continuing. Marin contacted a private investigator 3 months ago. The room went still. Wren lowered her pencil slowly. A what? Saskia opened the second folder. Background research into Tessa Lark, hospital records, paternity timelines, financial inheritance structures. Jesus Christ. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This had been planned, carefully, methodically. Wren whispered. She investigated my dead mom? I saw her eyes shine instantly with angry tears she refused to let fall. And right then, Something inside me hardened permanently. Not dramatic, not explosive, just final. Because there's a line decent people don't cross, and Marin had sprinted over it in heels. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the private investigator. Not because it shocked me, because it explained too much. Marin hadn't suddenly become suspicious over dinner at the Copper Heron. She'd been building toward that moment for months, maybe longer. Quietly collecting information, looking for leverage, looking for weakness, looking for a way to separate Wren from Garnet House. Around 9:30, after Wren finally fell asleep upstairs with one of the old quilt blankets wrapped around her shoulders, I poured myself a small glass of Amaro and sat alone in the library. Rain hammered the windows hard enough to blur the shoreline completely. That's when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored those. Something told me not to this time. "Mrs. Bellamy?" a man asked after I answered. "Yes?" "My name is Gideon Rowe. I believe you recently retained Saskia Pell." I straightened slightly. "Who are you?" "Formerly employed by Crane Shore Development." "Interesting. Very interesting." He lowered his voice. "You need to know your daughter-in-law wasn't acting alone." I said nothing. People reveal more when silence makes them nervous, and Gideon sounded nervous. "There were meetings," he continued quickly, "regarding your property. Dashiell Crane believed Elliot Bellamy could eventually pressure you into selling if inheritance control shifted away from the granddaughter." Exactly what I'd feared. I stared out toward the dark bay beyond the windows. So this was all business? A bitter laugh crackled through the phone. With Dashiell? Everything is business. He explained that Marin and Dashiell had been involved for over a year, not just romantically, but financially. Dashiell promised Marin a percentage stake in future redevelopment contracts if Garnet House became available. She told him Elliot was emotionally weak, Gideon said carefully. Easier to steer than confront directly. That hurt more than I expected, because it was true. Not flattering, not fair, but true. "What do you want from me, Mr. Rowe?" Silence. Then, "I quit 3 weeks ago." He exhaled shakily. "I thought the project was aggressive. I didn't realize they were trying to dismantle a child's inheritance through paternity litigation." God. Even hearing it phrased that clinically made me sick. He continued, "I have copies of internal planning proposals mentioning your property specifically. Now we were getting somewhere. Why help me?" Another pause. Then, quietly, "Because I had a grandmother once too." He emailed everything within the hour. Site renderings, projected condo layouts, internal notes. And there, buried halfway through a planning document, was the sentence that made my stomach turn cold. Removal of non-biological claimant significantly simplifies acquisition pathway. Non-biological claimant. That's how they described Wren. Like she was clutter. Like she was an obstacle instead of a little girl who used to collect smooth seashells in rain boots beside this house. I heard footsteps upstairs. Wren appeared at the library doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You okay?" I closed the laptop too quickly. Too late. She noticed. "What happened?" I hesitated, then decided she deserved honesty now more than protection. "Marin and Dashiell were planning around the house," I admitted. "For a while." Wren stood very still. She wanted me gone that badly? No child should ever ask that question. I motioned her closer and she curled beside me on the old velvet sofa Bennett bought, at an estate sale, back when we still had terrible taste and no money. She wanted control, I corrected softly. But yeah, I looked toward the dark windows. You were in the way. Wren swallowed hard, then quietly said something that made me realize she'd grown up far more than I wanted. I think Dad knew more than he's admitting. That one hit deep. Because I'd been wondering the same thing. Not about the affair. Elliot looked genuinely shattered by that. But the property discussions, the pressure, the inheritance conversations, he knew pieces, maybe not all, but enough. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Elliot. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. His voice sounded hollow, exhausted. Maren left. I closed my eyes briefly. Where did she go? Her parents' place. A long silence followed. Nora, did you know about Crane? No, I answered truthfully. But I suspected your wife cared more about this house than she ever admitted. Another silence. Then quietly. She told me she wanted security for our future. And you believed security meant taking something from Wren? His breathing changed slightly on the other end. That landed. Again. I never thought she'd go this far, he whispered. I looked toward the staircase where Wren stood half hidden in shadow, listening without speaking. Neither of us rescued him anymore. Finally, Elliot asked the question I think he'd been avoiding since the DNA results. Does Wren hate me? Wren closed her eyes when she heard that. And after everything, after the restaurant, the silence, the test, the humiliation, she still looked hurt instead of angry. That's the terrible thing about loving your parents. Even when they fail you, part of you keeps hoping they'll become who you needed all along. 3 days later, Elliot came to Garnet House again. This time he didn't knock right away. I watched him from the kitchen window, standing near the rusted gate in the cold evening fog, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, staring at the house like he suddenly understood how much of his life had actually happened inside it. Wren saw him, too. She stood beside me holding a mug of chamomile tea with both hands. You don't have to talk to him, I said quietly. But after a moment she whispered, No, I think I do. Elliot looked older when we opened the door. Not physically, spiritually, like somebody had removed all the noise from him and left only the tired parts underneath. I just want to talk, he said carefully. Wren nodded once and walked with him toward the back porch overlooking the bay. I stayed inside, pretending to reorganize recipe cards while watching their reflections faintly through the glass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Elliot sat down heavily on the porch swing Bennett built years ago. I failed you, he finally admitted. Simple sentence. Late sentence, but real. Wren stayed standing with her arms folded tightly across her chest against the cold wind. You let her make me feel fake, she said quietly. Elliot lowered his eyes immediately. I know. No, Wren answered. I don't think you do. That one hurt him visibly. She looked out toward the dark water before continuing. When Mom died, Grandma stayed. You visited. Her voice shook slightly but never broke. And then when Maren came, it felt like you kept choosing easier people over me. Jesus. 14 years old and already capable of saying things most adults spend decades avoiding. Elliot rubbed both hands over his face slowly. I thought keeping peace was protecting everyone. No, Wren said softly. Keeping peace usually just protected Marin. Silence again. The porch swing creaked gently beneath Elliot's weight, while fog rolled low across the shoreline. Finally, he whispered, I don't expect forgiveness right now. Good, Wren replied. Not cruel, not dramatic. Honest. Then she sat beside him for the first time since all of this started. Tiny movement, huge meaning. Inside the house, my phone buzzed with a message from Saskia. Trust finalized. Garnet House legally protected. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Done. Finally, done. No developer could touch it. No marriage could manipulate it. No courtroom scare tactic could erase Wren from it. Outside, Elliot looked toward the dark windows of Garnet House. Can I still come here? He asked carefully. Wren thought about it for a long time before answering. You can visit, she said quietly. But you don't get to decide what home means anymore. The house felt different after that conversation. Not happier, but cleaner somehow. Like a storm had finally passed through and carried years of rot out with it. For the first time in weeks, Wren slept through the night. No pacing upstairs, no bathroom light flicking on at 2 a.m. No muffled crying. She thought I couldn't hear through the old walls of Garnet House. I woke early and found her already outside, sitting on the porch roof over the sunroom with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a sketchbook balanced on her knees. You're gonna break your neck climbing up there one day, I called from below. She smirked faintly. Worth it for the view. That almost sounded like the old Wren again. Almost. I carried 2 mugs of coffee outside, mine black, hers mostly steamed milk with cinnamon because she still hated bitter drinks, and climbed carefully onto the lower section of the roof beside her. The bay stretched silver blue beneath the morning fog. Fishing boats moved slowly in the distance like ghosts. For a while, we just sat quietly. Then Wren suddenly asked, Do you think Marin ever loved Dad? Complicated question. Harder answer. I think she loved what he could give her, I said honestly. Wren nodded like she'd already expected that. And Dad? I looked out toward the water before answering. Your father loves people, I said slowly. But he also loves being needed. Sometimes that makes him easy to control. Wren drew absent circles onto her sketchbook page. I don't want to become like that. You won't. How do you know? Because unlike Elliot, she asked difficult questions instead of avoiding them. But I simply said, because you notice things. That afternoon, another surprise arrived. Marin. Honestly, if I were Nora, I would have stopped protecting grown adults from consequences years earlier. Too many women from that generation were taught to confuse sacrifice with love. They're not the same thing. And tell me honestly in the comments, would you ever forgive Elliot completely after all this? If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that being family is more than sharing DNA.